Hi, I'm Maggie Navarre, and today I'm going to provide some context for the novel The History of Mary Prince by describing aspects of the salt trade in Grand Turk. But before jumping into the salt trade, first we're going to take a look at the timeline of Mary's life up and until she entered the salt trade. In 1787, she was born in Bermuda under the ownership of George Darrell, and eventually was sold to Captain John Ingram in 1800, where she was able to remain in Bermuda. However, the main focus for her life for this presentation is the next segment from 1802 to 1812, where she was sold to Robert Darrell and taken to Grand Turk until they eventually returned back to Bermuda. On this map here, you can see the route that Mary Prince and many others took from Bermuda to the Turks and Caicos. Bermuda to the Turks and Caicos is approximately 750 miles, but due to winds, it only took about 5 days' journey. In the novel, Mary Prince stated, "At length he put me on board a sloop, and to my great joy sent me away to the Turks." However, unfortunately, Mary Prince did not know the horrors that would unfold for her as she entered the salt trade in Turks Islands. To provide more context for her quote, the sloop that Mary describes is a type of ship, specifically a sailboat with a single mast, which there is an image of here on the left. The salt trade made its way to the Turk Islands in the 1660s when many slaves were brought from Bermuda to Grand Turk to assist with the salt trade. The islands were completely financially dependent upon the success of the salt trade from this time period, from the 1660s to the 1960s. The introduction of slavery to the islands provided a source for cheap labor. In 1822, there was as many as 1,900 slaves in the Grand Turk Island alone. The slaves faced very difficult conditions, and under law, slaves who missed more than 48 hours of work in the 10-month season would lose their share of the profit. Here is a quote from Mary Prince where she describes being sold to the salt trade from Bermuda. She says, "My heart throbbed with grief and terror so violently that I pressed my hands quite tightly across my breast, but I could not keep it still, and it continued to leap as though it would burst out of my body. But who cared for that? Did one of the many bystanders who were looking at us so carelessly think of the pain that wrung the hearts of the woman and her young ones?" The quote demonstrates how horrific and inhumane the experience was for Mary Prince and many like her. Use of words and phrases implying movement, such as throbbed, could not keep it still, and leap, demonstrate how internally terrifying the slave trade was, as they are words typically associated with anxiousness. Many readers could have likely related to the feeling of terror, whereas you feel as though your heart might leap out of your chest. As well, in the quote, Mary succinctly describes her emotions through the usage of the words grief, terror, and pain. In addition, Mary calls out the number of bystanders who stood by so carelessly as such inhumane acts, such as the selling of human beings for profit, occurred. You may be wondering what's the purpose of the salt trade, and what's so important about salt in general, why people would commit such horrific acts to produce salt. Well, before refrigeration, salt was able to be used as a preservative. So in shipping industries, where sailors would be at sea for quite some time and would need food, salt fish, salt beef, and salt pork could feed them for long times and not go bad or rotten. A lot of the salt would also go to the public, where it would take about 40 pounds of salt per person per year for everyone's preservation needs. And much of this salt went to the US and Canada, which would help with fish salting. Within this quote, Mary Prince notes the use of salted foods for slaves and seamen. She says, "After that, those who have yams or potatoes or firewood to sell, hasten to the market to buy a dog's worth of salt fish or pork, which is a great treat for them." The quote also highlights the poor conditions for the slaves in the Grand Turks, that they weren't given enough food or nutrients and would have to try to sell things that they earned in order to get more. If you're anything like me, you may also be wondering why the Turk Islands? Well, the Turk Islands are notoriously warm, dry, and windy, and they have naturally occurring salinas. Salinas are naturally occurring inland depressions which fill with salt water from the nearby sea. These are ideal for salt raking. The slaves were also forced to create rock borders around the salinas, which created ponds that also aided in the use of salt raking. Salt raking is the process that would turn seawater into salt. They would lock the seawater into salinas using channels, otherwise kind of known as gates. The salt water would then be concentrated in the ponds until it evaporated into brine. The brine, which is very concentrated salt water, would then be placed in drying pans. It would take about 90 days for the salt to completely dry, and at which point the slaves would be forced to rake the salt into piles and shovel it into wheelbarrows for it to be placed in mounds or in bags for shipment. As it may be expected, many of the slaves suffered from serious health issues due to the strenuous circumstances they were forced to work under. Due to the brine and salt, many would end up with cuts that would not heal and would form boils on their skin. In addition, many suffered from blindness due to the sun reflecting on the water, white sand, and crystal salt. The lack of medical care and limited diet also poorly affected their health and left many of them very ill. In the novel The History of Mary Prince, it is also addressed some of the unlivable conditions they were forced to work in. At one part in the novel, they state, "We were then called again to our tasks, and worked through the heat of the day, the sun flaming upon our heads like fire, and raising salt blisters in those parts which were not completely covered. Our feet and legs, from standing in the salt water for so many hours, soon became full of dreadful boils, which eat down, in some cases, to the very bone, afflicting the sufferers with great torment." Many aspects of the salt trade are incorporated into the passage. Mary Prince touches on the aspects of health by describing the salt blisters and dreadful boils that would develop on the feet and legs of the slaves. She adds more personalized details as well to demonstrate just how dreadful the experience was, stating that the boils would occasionally eat down, in some cases, to the very bone. The words torment and sufferers also work to highlight how painful the experience was. In addition, Mary Prince uses many words that imply heat. In initial reading, the words heat, sun, flaming, and fire might seem to demonstrate that it is just very warm in Grand Turk, but there may also be a deeper meaning. Mary Prince could be using the words to demonstrate that Grand Turk was a living hell by describing the conditions using words such as fire and flaming, especially when they are used in conjunction with torment, sufferers, and dreadful. I hope the research surrounding Mary Prince's journey, the salt trade, the importance of salt, the Turks Islands, salt raking, and health related to salt raking provide context for the novel, The History of Mary Prince, as many of the topics come up directly and indirectly in the passages. With the needed context, readers can better understand the horrific circumstances faced by Mary Prince and others like her. I hope you were able to learn something from today's presentation. Here are the citations for the sources used to gather research.